Scam artists using religion and spirituality to exploit vulnerable people is nothing new. A sleazy preacher might ask one of his congregation to give money in exchange for asking God to heal their disease, or a self-proclaimed clairvoyant might offer to contact a deceased loved one and deliver a message for a small donation. Although deplorable, these scams rarely lead to anything worse than false hope and a light wallet. But in the early 1960s, in a small town in Mexico, an entire town was scammed, enslaved, with many even raped, tortured, and sacrificed, all under the false pretense of religious worship. At the head of it all was a scam artist like no other, a young woman who went by the sinister title, the High Priestess of Blood. Her real name, however, was Magdalena Solis. It began in 1962 when two brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, began formulating a scheme in order to get rich. They traveled to a small Mexican town named Yerba Buena. Its population consisted of about 50 largely illiterate, superstitious natives, making it the perfect location for the Hernandez brothers' scam. Upon entering Yerba Buena, the Hernandez brothers declared themselves to be prophets of the ancient Incan gods and goddesses, traveling to their small village in order to deliver a proposition to the people. In exchange for blind loyalty and subservience, the Hernandez brothers, on behalf of these gods, would offer the citizens of Yerba Buena more material wealth than they could imagine. Due to the citizens of this impoverished community being undereducated and easily duped by displays of confidence, this performance managed to convince them. Santos and Cayetano had successfully positioned themselves as the leaders of a new religious cult. They required their new devotees to make monetary donations to them in order to prove their faith, although there wasn't much wealth to be found in this town, so the get-rich aspect of the Hernandez brothers' plan didn't quite live up to their lavish expectations. But the Hernandez brothers exploited the citizens of Yerba Buena in many other hedonistic ways. They demanded sexual servitude from both the men and women and would force them to take part in peyote-fueled orgies to express their loyalty to the Incan gods and goddesses. Life was good for the Hernandez brothers, as they found themselves able to inflict any perverse carnal desire that passed through their minds onto the unwitting supplicants of Yerba Buena. But what about the riches that were promised? The chest of gold which these villagers were entitled to in exchange for their unwavering devotion. After several months of servitude, why hadn't Yerba Buena seen any of it? The locals were beginning to grow suspicious, and the Hernandez brothers found their grip on the community growing more and more tenuous with each passing day. Terrified of being exposed and forced to return to their mundane lives of petty thievery, the Hernandez brothers began to concoct the second phase of their plan. In the nearby town of Monterrey, the brothers met a 16-year-old girl named Magdalena Solis. Having no other marketable skills, she was working as a prostitute, while her older brother served as her pimp. She was desperate for a different lifestyle, which made her vulnerable enough to be persuaded to join the Hernandez brothers' facade. The plan was this: the young, beautiful Magdalena would travel with the brothers back to Yerba Buena. There, Magdalena would pretend to be an ancient goddess who went by the name Coatlicue. And with a bit of sleight of hand, the brothers would hopefully reinvigorate the religious devotion of the people of Yerba Buena. After returning to their village, the brothers called the population into a nearby cave system, which was said to be where the alleged treasures were hidden, its exact location to be revealed once the local citizens were deemed worthy enough to receive it. Once in the cave, the brothers introduced Magdalena as Coatlicue in an extravagant display of showmanship featuring conjuring tricks of smoke and mirrors which would be laughably cliché today, but were mesmerizing to the isolated people of Yerba Buena. For those of you who are knowledgeable about ancient religions, you may already know that Coatlicue is actually an Aztec goddess, not an Incan goddess as the Hernandez brothers had claimed to be prophets of. Luckily for them, this oversight went completely unnoticed, and the people of Yerba Buena accepted the young Magdalena as their new deity. Now, here's where the story gets strange. Keep in mind the background of the young Magdalena Solis. Impoverished, uneducated, selling her body for money just to buy food. And now here she was, worshipped as an ancient goddess of immutable cosmic power. What do you think her reaction was? Did she become timid and overwhelmed by this amount of attention? Actually, no. The opposite happened. The yarn the Hernandez brothers spun for the citizens of Yerba Buena was so hypnotic, so convincing, that Magdalena began believing it herself. Very soon she completely forgot she was taking part in a scam and began to legitimately see herself as her followers saw her, the reincarnation of the goddess Coatlicue. Power-hungry, delusional, and perhaps even spiteful for the difficult childhood she was forced to live, Magdalena embraced her new role with psychopathic enthusiasm. Her descent into madness began quickly after she took power, when she decided that the appropriate punishment for two individuals who had voiced skepticism for her divinity was death. It became known throughout Yerba Buena that any who disobeyed her would meet the same fate, and over the course of her reign she brought in as many as 12 people into the caves and sacrificed them. And these deaths were not quick executions, but rather elaborate rituals which became more bizarre as time went on. As Magdalena became obsessed with her identity as Coatlicue, who, according to mythology, was eternally youthful, she began drinking blood of those she sacrificed, a practice she believed would prevent aging. She coaxed the Hernandez brothers into doing the same, and they reluctantly obeyed, as at this point Magdalena was the unquestionable goddess of Yerba Buena, having clearly outgrown her role as a pawn in the brothers' scam. It wasn't long before Magdalena began to incorporate sex and drugs into her tortures. Often with large amounts of peyote in her system, she would set fire to her victims, slowly drain their blood into ornate chalices in which she would drink. Reportedly, she enjoyed removing the still-beating hearts from her victims as they lay writhing in pain on the cave floor. Soon, the promise of treasure chests full of riches no longer served as incentive to worship this young woman. The people of Yerba Buena simply did it out of fear and awe. And for months, Magdalena Solis continued to live up to her name as the High Priestess of Blood. That is, until May of 1963, when, by pure chance, a 14-year-old boy from a neighboring village named Sebastian happened to see what was going on in Yerba Buena. Sebastian was out spelunking in the cave systems that ran along the outskirts of his town when he began hearing disturbing sounds, moaning, screaming, coming from within the cave. He approached the area where the sounds were coming from, and what he saw terrified him. The blood, the sex, the death, it was all too much for young Sebastian to process. He ran 15 miles to the nearest police station. When asked what was wrong, Sebastian couldn't articulate to the authorities what he had seen. The only word he could think of to describe it was vampires, which is what he told the police were lurking in the nearby cave. Skeptical and expecting to find a reasonable explanation to account for the boy's testimony, Officer Luis Martinez followed the boy back to Yerba Buena to investigate the cave. Unfortunately, these two were never seen again. We can only assume that they, too, became the victims of Magdalena's ever-growing bloodlust. After time passed without word from Officer Martinez or the boy, a team of officers were sent after them to investigate. The Hernandez brothers had clearly understood the ramifications of sacrificing Officer Martinez and the young Sebastian. Not prepared to surrender, they drew their guns and waited for them. As soon as the police entered Yerba Buena, the Hernandez brothers opened fire. The shootout lasted until both Santos and Cayetano Hernandez were shot and killed. It wasn't long after that Magdalena herself was arrested. It's widely believed that Magdalena Solis was responsible for the torture and death of at least 8 people in Yerba Buena during her reign as the High Priestess of Blood. Some estimate this number as high as 15. Despite this, Magdalena herself was sentenced to only 50 years in prison, an unjustly mild sentence considering the atrocity she'd committed. So, why was the sentence so light? Well, the authorities were unable to hold her responsible for the number of deaths which took place between 1962 and 1963. Although they discovered the bones of the deceased victims and knew of the blood cult, this evidence was merely circumstantial in pinning it to Magdalena. And of course, the people of Yerba Buena refused to testify against her or to disclose all of the horrendous rape and violence they'd witnessed carried out on Magdalena's behalf. Even after being caught, the psychological hold she had on these people was so strong that they dared not implicate her. She was still, after all, their goddess. This video was one of my first ventures into a topic which isn't at all internet related, and I'd love to know what you guys thought of it. My plan for this channel was and still is to bring you the strangest obscure internet oddities I can find. But every once in a while I run across a case which is so bizarre and interesting that I get inspired to write about it, even if it predates the internet altogether. So you may occasionally see me branching off like this in the future. If you enjoyed this video and look forward to similar content, please consider subscribing. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, please leave them in the comments below. Also, if you'd like to stay up to date on channel news, feel free to visit me on Twitter at Atrocity Guide.